Hello and welcome to the video where we're going to be looking at putting together this angel and demon sculpture. Now this is based on something that I did some years ago now, and I really like the basic setup of this, but I think my ambition in this particular piece sort of exceeded my ability, and so I got some way through the sculpture, but there were various sort of proportional issues that I kind of got wrong with it, which led me to not finishing it. But as you can see, it's got quite an extreme pose and there's quite a lot of dynamic sort of action to it, and so this is sort of one of those that's been on the mental list of things to do for some years, and so I wanted to sort of revisit it. However, I wanted to go with a slightly different approach to it this time, so you can see there were some clear differences between the sculptures, but they've both got that sort of dynamic kind of motion to them, and they're both sort of suspended in sort of mid-air, mid-fight. Now obviously this is quite an extreme pose, and I quite like this idea in the sense that a lot of classical sculpture, which I've been looking at quite a lot recently, because that stuff was sort of carved from single blocks of marble, you couldn't really do these sort of more extreme poses with it, because in this case I've got one character balanced on the wrist of another character, so she's being held aloft by the right arm of the demon character, so all of the weight of that character has to rest on the arm of the demon. And so, you know, if you were sculpting this in marble, for example, I'm pretty sure the marble would just break under the weight. You know, it's a very thin piece to be holding up that weight. But it is something you can do at sort of a smaller scale, particularly if you're building an armature. You can have something strong within the sculpture which will support all that weight and allow you to do that pose. So in this case I'm going to build quite a strong armature in order to support all of this weight. And so what I've started off with here is sort of a column of wood initially, and that's going to be the column of arms which are coming out of the summoning circle. And what I'm going to do is transition to steel and build a steel armature to hold all this stuff in place. Now I don't routinely work with steel, so I don't have a welder or any tools that you would normally use if you were working with this stuff routinely, so I'm having to use what I've got. So I'm using hand saws and drills and bolts to hold all this stuff together and to shape the steel. Now the original sculpture was partially inspired by some lyrics from a band called My Dying Bride, I'm a big fan of, and there's a line in one of their songs which is a chorus of agony from heaven, which I thought was quite a cool name for a sculpture, and it sort of evoked for me, you know, the idea of sort of an angel casting a demon out of heaven. And so I sort of rolled with that idea, and that was sort of the basic inspiration for this sculpture. For this one, because the angel is sort of reacting to the demon character, whereas in the previous case the angel was attacking the demon, I didn't really feel that the angel in the new sculpture was sort of descending from heaven in the way that the previous sculpture it is, and so the title didn't seem appropriate, and so I'm calling this one Within the Void We Are Restless, which is a lyric from another band I like, Neo Obliviscaris. I think the line in their song is Within the Void We Are Breathless, but I quite like the phrase restless, and the idea here is that the column of arms is going to be breaking out of a kind of a summoning circle and attacking the angel character who's sort of reacting to the demon that's sort of coalescing out of this pillar of arms. And so I quite like the idea that there was some sort of restless entity within the void that had been released and was then attacking the main character. So that's sort of the background for the idea with this piece. So what I've come up with are these sockets which will allow me to put various bits of steel together and take them apart quite easily. So as you can see, I've got this socket, and this piece of steel slots quite nicely into that. So that's going to allow me to have things like arms come off and legs and things like that. I want the piece to be modular so I can take it apart for storage if I need to. It's going to be quite big, and so if I do want to transport it somewhere or just put it away, I need to be able to take it apart into separate pieces. Now only part of the armature needs to be steel, the rest can be regular aluminium or copper, so I'm just adding some aluminium wire to this for the rest of the armature. And I'm thinking ahead about how I'm going to be doing this, because the demon character is going to be quite monstrous and have quite a lot of texture to him. I'm going to sculpt that in monster clay and make a mould. So these aluminium pieces will only be in place temporarily while I do the clay sculpture. I'll then take them away once I've made a mould, and they'll be replaced by resin. So there's the basic idea of the demon character, and as you can see he's reaching up and grabbing the beginning of the armature for the angel. Now for the angel, this is going to be sculpted in epoxy, so I'm not going to be making any moulds of this. What I sculpt will be the final piece. So for this I'm making it out of a variety of different materials. I'm using some aluminium for the legs. For the upper body, because there's going to be wings which I want to be detachable, I'm using a copper pipe, so I can solder that together, and that will allow me to have mounting points for arms, wings and head. For the leg, you can also see I've got a mounting point which will allow me to take the leg off as well. So this is going to be quite modular, and I think that's going to be useful as well as for storage, but also I can sort of change pieces as I go if I need to. So if I need to re-sculpt the leg or the arm, for example, where the two characters join, I can do that. Right, so there's the finished armature, and this actually took me a couple of days to actually get right. It's quite involved, and it involved quite a lot of thinking ahead to make sure I didn't sort of trip myself up later down the line. So I think I've got this in a pretty decent position, so I can now start sculpting. As I mentioned, the column is going to be comprised of loads of grasping arms that sort of form a tentacle, and obviously arms are complicated, hands are complicated, so they take a little while to sculpt. So in order to get around that, what I'm going to do is make a mould of these arms that I've sculpted up, and what I can do is pour in molten monster clay to make multiple copies of these. So that should hopefully make sculpting the column much easier than having to do every single one from scratch. Now the column's going to be made out of arms, but also sort of mutated flesh. You know, it's going to be a sort of a monstrous thing. So what I've done is to cover the wooden frame that I've made in parcel tape. This whole thing is going to be moulded and cast in resin, so the parcel tape will just make it easier for me to get the clay back off the sculpture once I've made the mould. And what I'm doing is just covering the whole thing in monster clay first off, just so I've got a surface to work against. Melting it in the microwave makes it much easier, so I can just sort of paste it on. Now I'm going to have some fun using the fact that you can melt the monster clay to create some textures here. Previously I've poured molten monster clay into water to get some interesting organic shapes. What I've also seen, this was shown on Gary Tunnicliffe's channel, Hollywood Assassin. He's a special effects guy who's well known for doing the Pinhead makeups for the Hellraiser sequels. But he had a really cool quick video showing a technique whereby you can melt the monster clay with a blowtorch and then quickly blast it with water, and that gives you some quite nice organic looking textures. So that's one of the techniques I'm going to have a go at. Now I'm not focused on the tentacles straight away, but I just want to have a quick go just to sort of see what's possible. And obviously I'm doing this in the garden because there's lots of water flying about. Yeah, as you can see, you can get some very interesting results here. Now I need to bear in mind that I'm going to mould this, so some very intricate, very thin detail which has been created here might not work so well in the context of a mould. But nevertheless, this does seem a really cool way of getting some interesting shapes into the monster clay. So I'll be exploring this in a little bit more detail when I come to sculpt the tentacle proper, but for the time being I want to concentrate on the figures. Now given that this is quite a large sculpture, it's actually sort of interfering with the ceiling of the workshop, so for a change I'm sculpting this in the garden just so I can walk about it a bit more freely. So that does mean I'm in shot a little bit more than I normally would be, but hopefully that won't matter too much. I'm using Smooth On Freeform Sculpt this, which is an epoxy clay. It's very sticky, so it's sort of easy to work with and sort of not, you know. I wouldn't use it for sort of fine detail, but it does dry very, very hard. So what I found myself doing is using it for sort of doing the main blocking out of the sculpture, so sort of doing the larger shapes of the body. I can then come in with other epoxies like Aves epoxy and Milliput and use those for finer detail. So at this stage I'm really just blocking out the main shapes of the body. Now for the demon figure, like the tentacle, this is going to be sculpted in monster clay, and I'm then going to make a mould of the whole thing. So what I'm doing here is again just covering the armature in parcel tape, so when I come to actually take the monster clay off the sculpture, that's just going to make my life a little bit easier. The reason I'm using monster clay for this one is that I want to have a lot of organic detail, and so I want to be able to use the techniques I've shown previously where I can melt the monster clay with like soldering irons and blowtorches and things. So I can't really do that with epoxy, so I'm going to do this in monster clay. But like I say, that will mean that I need to make a mould of it for my final piece. And again with this one I'm really just blocking out the main shapes of the body. It's taken me a little while to get the sort of main sort of poses down. I ended up repositioning this a few times just to get something that looked a little bit more natural. So there's a very rough early positioning of the two figures. And I'm sort of thinking the the angel character has maybe slightly too bulky up top, perhaps. It's a little bit difficult to tell, so obviously the limbs aren't finalised, but I'm paying particular attention to this. I've had a few situations where I've finished a piece, it's all painted and done, and then I look at it a few weeks later and think, you know what, actually the proportions maybe aren't quite right, or this bit could have been bulked out a little bit more. So I'm spending a lot of time here just making sure this looks right from all possible avenues. So I've spent quite a lot of time just putting the two figures together, looking at them from different angles, taking photos. So I really want to make sure that the composition just sort of holds up from all possible viewing points. Now, unlike Monster Clay, of course, you can't really sculpt this back down once it's set, because you know, the minute you mix the epoxy together, it's going to start setting. So I found that a lot of the sculpture for this piece actually took place with sandpaper and Dremel bits, and I actually found that a really, really useful, interesting process to use. You know, because you can sort of take bits off very, very slowly, very subtly. And that made it a little bit easier to sort of slowly creep up on the result that you wanted to get to. So if a piece was like a little bit too thick, you know, you could like very slowly take that down. And because it was happening so slowly, it was quite a natural way to refine those shapes. So yeah, like I say, a lot of the sculpture here was really done with sandpaper and Dremel bits. Also refining the Monster Clay figure here as well, and I actually ended up repositioning the leg, which sort of gave it a bit more, I don't know, made it look like he was sort of kicking off something and launching himself at the angel. Having the leg down sort of made it look a little bit like he was floating somehow. So like I say, there's just a lot of early repositioning, sort of trying to get the poses right for this before I sort of get into any detail. And like I said, I was really paying attention to making sure I had the proportions right, so having a printout to scale like this is really, really useful, because you can kind of use that to give you a direct comparison to make sure you've got things in the right shape. Now, as I mentioned with the angel character, I kept feeling like that the torso was a little bit too big. I was trying to go for a kind of a muscular, powerful character, but obviously it is a feminine character as well, so I was trying to strike that balance between making it recognisably female, but also kind of quite a powerful, you know, kind of strong figure. And so to that end, I've sort of drawn in some of the body proportions in pencil here, just to give myself an idea of how this should look. And I think I've got to a position where I'm sort of happy with the proportions. So what I'm going to now start doing is coming in with some Aves epoxy and actually start adding some detail to the piece. Now, for some reason this stuff seems to have doubled in price in the UK, so I was lucky enough to find this larger tub at the old price online, so I grabbed that quickly before the price went up. So I've got a ton of epoxy here, so there should be more than enough for this character. So I'm just mixing some up and starting to add some clothing detail onto the piece. So I'm starting with the boot, and I'm just doing a basic foot shape there. So this followed the same basic process as a lot of the epoxy sculptures that I've worked on, and that's simply that you add a bit, let it dry, add a bit more, let it dry, and so forth. So you're sort of slowly building this up in layers. So as you can see, I've also worked my way up and added some trouser wrinkle detail in there as well. I'm just trying to get this looking realistic. And I'm toying with adding some knee armour to this thing as well. I'm not sure if it really calls for it now. It sort of ended up in a slightly less fantastical direction than I was originally intending. But I might come back and add that at a later date. I've built this shape up very slowly, and then I'm now at a point where I can start refining those details with files and sandpaper and so forth. So I'm also trying to build up the shape of a jacket here, so I'm just working in some shoulder details. I'm using a paintbrush with water just to smooth this down. That's one of the good things about Aves epoxy. It's quite easy to smooth out just with a paintbrush and water. Now I want this to have a sort of a high collar, and so what I'm going to use is some of this mesh. So I'm going to glue this around the neck in the basic shape of the collar, and I'm going to come in with some epoxy and sculpt over that. And that will just give me an armature to work against. Now the mesh idea worked really well for the collar, so I'm just building this up with some more epoxy. One thing that I did do, which was a bit of a mistake, was to use steel mesh instead of aluminium. What that means is it's a little bit tougher than the aluminium, and that meant that there was some fine metal strands sort of sticking out of the collar, which were a little bit harder to sand down. They would have been a bit easier if they were aluminium, of course. And as I said, a lot of the sculpting of this piece was done with sandpaper, and that's continued to be the case, but also a lot of refining of the detail has been done with wire wool. You can only sort of sculpt something so smooth, so if you want to get a nice smooth finish with this sort of thing, I use wire wool just to give them a nice smooth finish. So what I also wanted it to have is a long flowing coat, and so to that end what I've done is to drill some holes in the backside and add some square brass tubing in. So this gives me some anchor points that I can attach an armature to, which I can then sculpt over in the shape of a flowing coat. So I'll just add some wire and mesh to this, so that gives me something I can work against. So what I'm going to do is come in with some more freeform sculpt and just sculpt the basic shape of the coat. I want these to be pieces that can come away for transport, so I'm going to add some masking tape to the back of the sculpture, and that's just so that the epoxy that I'm adding to the armature here won't stick to the main sculpture. So I'm just pressing this into the mesh, and the good thing with this is it can actually be quite thin because the mesh will hold the epoxy in place as it dries, and once it does dry it gives you a rigid form to sculpt against. So once I've got the basic form in place, I can then come in with more Aves epoxy and start bulking that out into a sort of a flowing piece of fabric. Right, so there's some pics of how this is looking so far, and I'm really liking the way that the fabric of the cloak is kind of flowing about. Obviously it's a little bit rough at the moment, but I think that's looking really cool. So now that the epoxy's dried, I can now pull these pieces off the main sculpture, and as you can see the masking tape stop that sticking to the main body. So I'm continuing to further refine those shapes with some sandpaper and a Dremel, and this took a lot of back and going forth, just trying to get this to look like a natural flowing piece of fabric. I used quite a lot of Aves epoxy on top of the freeform sculpts just to get that detail in and get some nice smooth flowing shapes. Now obviously there's going to be a join in the back where the two pieces of coat meet the body, because they're separate pieces, and so I need a way to hide that join. So what I'm thinking of doing is putting a belt across the join to hide where the two pieces meet. Now I need a way of attaching those together, so what I'm doing is cutting an aperture into the back of the sculpture, just putting some neodymium magnets inside. And what I've decided to do, obviously the sculpture's in motion, and so you want the coat to be flowing about, and it makes sense that the belt would be sort of suspended in mid-air as well. So what I'm going to do is make the belt out of some aluminium strip here. So I've just cut this from a sheet, and it's really pliable, so I can just bend this into any shape I want. The cool thing is if it does get sort of caught on something, it won't really break, it will bend, so that makes it quite easy to use in sculpture like this. A very thin piece of epoxy like this will just snap. So this is quite a nice way of doing this. So what I'm doing is just bending this into the correct position so it looks like it's flowing around the body. So I had a few goes at working on the anchor points for this. Obviously I need some additional neodymium magnets to hold the belt sections in place. My initial attempts didn't really work, but I got there in the end. But here's the final pieces. They probably need a little bit more refinement, but for the time being that's working really well. So I think that's not looking too bad. I might add some utility pouches or something on the back just to hide that joint further, but I think that works quite well. So now turning my attention to the wing, and what I want to have for this piece is one wing which is feathered and one wing which is mechanical. It's going to be a kind of a steampunk kind of idea, so I thought it would be really cool if the character was sort of mechanically enhanced. I guess she's lost a wing at a certain point in history perhaps, and so she's got a prosthetic. So I'm concentrating first off on the feathered wing, and I'm sort of treating this much in the same way I did the coat sections. I'm attaching a armature in place, and that's just with some square brass tube which is attached to some copper piping, and then I'm covering the whole thing in mesh, and I'm going to then cover the whole thing in epoxy to give myself a firm structure to sculpt against. So there's the beginning of those wing sections, and I'm cutting out additional shapes to go around the whole body of the wing. Now, as you can appreciate, this took quite a long time to do. There's, I don't know, hundreds of feathers, I think. So, obviously I just had to get on with it, stick a film on and just sculpt feathers while I was watching. So I didn't video a lot of this, but the basic method was, to put a blob of epoxy in, cut in the feather detail, let that set, then come in and do another one on top of it, and so on and so on. So yeah, took a long time, but getting there. So I'm now at a stage where I've more or less finished the front of the wing, but obviously if you turn it over now I've got to do all of the back, so still a fair way to go. I'm also starting to add some detail to the legs, so I'm sculpting in a belt section here, and obviously the belt's going to indent the leg and the trousers a little bit, so I'm just sort of cutting a channel in to show that that's sort of pressing into the angel's leg. As well as the coat having a long collar, I want the shirt to have that as well, so I'm just doing an additional mesh section and then coming in again with some more epoxy for the collar of the shirt. This time around I remembered to use aluminium mesh here, so this was a lot easier to sand down, so it's made my life a little bit easier there. What I'm also doing here is sculpting in like a necktie. That's really just to hide the join of where the head meets the body. Originally I was thinking about having the head as a separate piece so I could take it off when I needed to, and that was really useful when I was sculpting the head, but eventually I decided to actually glue that in place, and I was able to build up that necktie over the gap to fully join those two pieces together. Now for the face, I decided to have a go at doing this in epoxy. Faces are tricky because you tend to want to go back and forth on them quite a lot, particularly at this scale. The details are quite small, and so getting the proportions correct can be challenging. But I thought I'd have a go at doing it in epoxy initially, and I sort of got halfway through and got to a certain point. I thought, you know what, I'm not quite sure this is looking quite as good as I want it to. It's okay from a distance, but no, it needs some work. So in the end I decided I just needed a longer working time effectively. So what I ended up doing was cutting off the front of the face and replacing the entire thing with Sculpey. So I'm just having a go at doing this in Sculpey here, and actually this actually worked out. I ended up with a face that I really like the look of, and so I'm glad I took that approach. Although I'm tending to use epoxy much more frequently these days than Sculpey, every so often you do find a situation where Sculpey is actually the correct choice. So yeah, I ended up redoing the face in Sculpey. And as I've said, the advantage here is I can just keep going back and forth on this, trying to get the face fully correct. So I don't have to worry about the drying time of the epoxy here, and I can take my time and really get the details set out. And something I find with faces I do, sometimes they can be a little bit expressionless. I think it's partly because I'm trying to get the proportions right, and so you kind of want the face in sort of standard pose, you know, rather than sort of in an extended kind of expression. But obviously the angel's being attacked by a demon made of arms, so it should probably look a little bit surprised. So I'm trying to work in a surprise kind of frown to the angel's face here, so I ended up sort of opening the mouth slightly and furrowing the brow, that sort of thing. Obviously it needs some hair and so forth. I haven't cooked the Sculpey yet, I'm sort of holding off just in case I want to make some changes, but I'm fairly happy with it. So before I cooked the Sculpey, I decided to actually start sculpting in some of the hair. I wanted this to have sort of a dynamic pose, so the hair is sort of blowing in the wind or in motion as the character moves. So I'm just trying to get some of the hair in here before I cook the Sculpey. That's just to sort of make sure that the whole idea is working. You know, I don't need to go back and rework the face once I start adding in the hair. But I was pretty happy with that, so at this point I'm happy to cook the face. Obviously some of the hair is in place, but that being epoxy, that's not going to mind the heat. Now, as I mentioned, I also want the Angel to be sort of cybernetically enhanced. She's going to have a mechanical wing, so I thought, well, why don't I also add a mechanical arm? And this is something I actually made for the Lady on the Balcony sculpture that I made some time ago. And the original idea was that she might have 3 arms, one of them being mechanical. I didn't end up doing that in the end. I thought it would overcomplicate the sculpture, but I've still got the arm I made, or at least the basics of it. So I thought this would be a good thing to use here. So I'm going to attach that to the body that I've got. So what I need to do is just actually cut this down slightly and reposition the armature. So I'm just cutting through the epoxy here and repositioning the piece. What I ended up doing actually was just in the end removing the entire arm and gluing in a new piece of armature there. So I've got the pose I needed there, so that's looking pretty good. As you can see, I've got sort of beginnings of a shoulder pad there as well, and that's just some additional resin that I've sanded and cut down to size. So I'm turning my attention back to the demon now, having spent quite a lot of time on the Angel, and I'm first off separating the body from the main column. There's a socket there which allows that to be taken off, so I'm just cutting through the monster clay to allow that to happen. And I've started to use some of my monster clay arms to do that. So as I mentioned, what I did here was to make a mould of some pre-sculpted arms. I could then pour molten monster clay into that mould to create multiples of the same thing. So I think this is going to really help me make this section. So I'm just using those copies that I've made to try and build up a kind of column of arms. Having used my pre-designed arms to build up the column, I started thinking what would be good would be to have a pre-sculpted piece where the arms were actually gripping the forearms. And so what I've done is to make this arm with a hand gripping it. I can then use that to build up some shapes with those pieces. So I've poured up a bunch of copies there. I'm using those to try and build up the column. Now for the demon character, I wasn't quite sure where to go with this. I didn't have quite as strong an idea of what he should look like as I did the Angel. And so I sort of went back and forth a little bit. So initially I thought I might have hands sort of bursting out of his body, so I'm sort of trying to do something sort of a bit gruesome here where he's sort of holding open his torso and hands coming out. That was an initial idea, but in the end I didn't think that was really the right way to go. So I ended up doing this instead, where there's sort of like an explosion of sort of I don't know, sort of organic matter from which arms are sort of appearing. So I like that a lot better. So that's sort of the approach I've ended up taking, but I still think it's going to take a little bit of refinement. I also think I want to work in a lot more sort of flesh-like detail into the column of arms. So this particular section of the piece is still a bit of a work in progress. I mean, it all is, but this is a little bit more embryonic than the Angel bit. But I think this is where I've got to so far. So if you've stuck through it this far, then thanks very much for watching. There should be more on this coming. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.